by just saying that I arrived this morning from Beirut, and I say that partly to excuse any incoherency in my speech, because it's been a long night, but partly also today Israel has been bombing Beirut for the first time since the ceasefire came into effect, which has killed, at the moment, 5 people and injured dozens more. And if there was any more reason you needed to be out on the streets next Saturday, there you have it. But I wanted to talk today about the situation that we have in Britain with a far right in ascendancy and a resurgent fascist street movement. The Tommy Robinson demonstration in September was estimated around 200,000 people. It was probably the biggest far-right demonstration in British history. And since April, the Reform Party led by Nigel Farage has consistently been at the top of the polls. And I think today, the far right are more organized, have a greater capacity to mobilize than they have at any point in recent times, and that is also beyond sort of spontaneous bursts of violence like we saw in the riots that started in Southport last year, which have sort of transformed into demonstrations which are attracting a growing periphery, coupled with a parliamentary expression which is connected internationally, which is well funded with the likes of Elon Musk, and which is gaining, I think, the backing of sections of capital and ruling class. And I think this is a danger which needs to be treated with the utmost urgency. I think we cannot afford the callousness which we've seen from some parts of the left. And I think the background to this moment is, to paraphrase Gramsci, the old is dying, the new is struggling to be born, and now is the time of morbid symptoms. I think the period of the neoliberal phase of capitalism, its relentless expansion through globalization, and the hegemony of Western capital is coming to an end. And for coming on 20 years, we have been in perpetual crisis, while the center, both the right wing and the traditional parties of capital, as well as the center-left and social democracy that entirely capitulated to neoliberalism, has tried desperately to cling on to that system and to keep it afloat. And I think the result has been a steep decline in living standards, increasing authoritarianism and militarism, and a polarization of politics to both the left and the right. And the current phase of far-right organization has grown out of the advance of far-right movements and parties across Europe and in the United States, out of the constant and consistent attack on refugees and Muslims from the entire political class and media establishment for decades, and the backlash to the failures of globalization that has been solely about the interests of capital, which is focused on extracting profits from the population both here and abroad, which relies both on immigration here and the backing of military might that has destroyed the Middle East, and which has created the refugees who are trying to seek sanctuary here, and has tied that and the subsequent growth in inequality to a language of liberalism and humanitarianism. And I think it's also in part a product of the failure of the left to consolidate the sort of polarization to the left, either through capitulations like we've seen in Greece and in Germany, or through the decimation of those projects by the state with the likes of Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, or even I think with the tameness and sectionalism of the trade union movement, particularly here during the strike wave of 2022 and 23, which stopped it from being the effective assault on the ruling class that it could have been, and which, by the way, I think was part of a conscious turn against political trade unionism, which is why we've seen the labour movement so lacking in mobilising over the question of Palestine, or indeed in taking on the far right. And I think there are parallels to be drawn with the betrayals of the social democratic parties and the pent-up revolutionary energy of hope for a better society in the early 20th century across Europe, which led to the growth of fascism. So I think for us, turning the tide against the fascists and the far right today requires us to A, confront, outnumber and demoralize the fascists on the streets, to B, isolate the fascists who are at the heart of the movement and split them off from their wider periphery and those who they are seeking to manipulate, and C, to provide a socialist alternative, an insurgent left-wing pole of attraction. And I think to do these things, we need a specifically anti-fascist movement that is aimed directly at exposing the fascists and mobilizing both the targeted ethnic minority communities and the working class more broadly in their defense and in their own interests, using slogans specifically aimed at countering the far-right slogans rather than sort of vague anti-racist sentiment. I think it has been a huge mistake that Stand Up to Racism failed for 2 years to oppose one of the greatest expressions of racist violence of our lifetimes, the genocide in Gaza, which the far right, by the way, identify with and support. And I think in making this mistake, the anti-racist movement has utterly failed to mobilize what is the largest anti-racist and most organized section of society in challenging the far right. And we spoke in the earlier session about identity politics, which I think has led to this dangerous distortion where, for many people on the left, racism has been separated from the system and the state which produces it and has focused almost entirely on individual prejudices. Part of which has allowed the state and corporations to sort of cosplay as being anti-racist, and which has been used against us with, for example, the smears of anti-Semitism against Palestine solidarity. And I think it's also led to the backlash against the establishment being driven towards racist views. So I think one of the things we have to do is to reassert a class-based analysis of racism and collective solutions based on solidarity. And I think it means that we need an actual united front against fascism. I think we need to be working with and organizing with groups and communities who are to the right of us, who we don't necessarily agree with everything on. Because I think if we remain siloed on sectarian lines, we will not build the kind of movement we need, either qualitatively or quantitatively. And I think this also applies to the debates that have emerged around your party and the so-called social conservatism and the writing off of particularly Muslims, along with some on the left, from our movement based on the sort of purity politics of some sections of the left. And I'm not suggesting that there should be no criticism or political argument. For example, when Adnan Hussein compared and equated fascists with anti-fascists, or when Iqbal Mohammed called on the army to break the Birmingham bin strike, nor for the MPs to sort of automatically have a leadership position just because they're MPs. But I think some on the left who are celebrating the departure of Adnan Hussein and Iqbal Mohammed from your party is a prime example of a sort of unstrategic thinking and a narrowness and the sort of cul-de-sac that sort of rhetoric leads to. And I think it is a travesty that this is now damaging the coalition between the left and Muslim communities that has been the centerpiece of why we have had the strongest anti-war and pro-Palestine movement in the world, I think, for 2.5 decades. And the outcome of this road can be seen in the failures of the left in places like Belgium, Germany, Turkey, and until recently in France, where the left inadvertently helped to strengthen the far right and the imperialist states by going along with attacks on Muslim communities. And I think a politics that is based on identity, that is focused on what differentiates us, that is based on policing and ostracizing rather than winning arguments through uniting in struggle, be it with people who are religious or with people who, for example, think the country is full and there is no space for immigrants and support some sort of immigration control, is, I think, a politics that will get us nowhere. The examples recently of Liverpool, where black communities came together and spearheaded a broad class-based mobilization to stop fascists from marching in Toxic, or in Tower Hamlets, where the Muslim community united with the left and trade unions and progressive campaigns to successfully stop fascists marching through Whitechapel, show that it can be done. It's something that we need to replicate, I think, on a national scale to make every borough a borough that fascists cannot march through. The examples of independent candidates in the general election last year and the local elections this year in Preston, or for that matter in New York City and in France, where candidates stood on platforms that were anti-austerity, that addressed the cost of living crisis, while still being explicitly anti-racist and anti-imperialist, showed that that can be done. And I think to do these things, we need an anti-sectarian, revolutionary left that can organize from below, that can make these arguments about uniting in struggle, that can help to join the dots in this way and fight for a kind of strategy which is based on working class unity and self-organization, and which is geared towards confronting the system, not just the morbid symptoms, but the actual rotten system that produces those symptoms. And I'll end with this quote, which I think sort of aptly summarizes the role that revolutionary socialists should play. It's from Tony Cliff, who was a Jewish Palestinian martyr, who many in this room might know. And he said, because fascism is a movement of despair, while socialism is a movement of hope, to fight fascism, it is necessary not only to fight the fascists, but also the conditions that lead to despair. One has to fight the rats, but also the sewers in which the rats multiply. One has to fight the fascists, but also capitalism that creates the conditions that breed fascism, unemployment, bad housing, social deprivation, etc. And I think these are the sort of multi-pronged approach that we need as socialists, to build that united movement that confronts them on the streets, to create that socialist alternative, and that is non-sectarian. Thanks.